Welcome back to our studios here in Lahore. I'm Hamza Amjad. Now, US President Donald Trump has again offered to help Pakistan and India resolve the conflict over occupied Kashmir. Talking to the media at the White House, President Trump said he shares a good relationship with both countries. Trump said that the conflict between India and Pakistan over Kashmir was a little less heated in comparison to 2 weeks ago. Pakistan has called for the formation of an independent commission to probe human rights violations in Indian-occupied Kashmir. Addressing the UN Human Rights Council in Geneva, Pakistan's Foreign Minister Shah Mahmood Qureshi said the situation in the valley should be of direct international concern. Qureshi said Indian forces have arrested over 6,000 people, political workers, activists, students and professionals. Pakistan has called on the United Nations to settle the worsening human rights situation in Indian-occupied Kashmir. Meeting the UN Secretary-General Antonio Guterres, Pakistan's Ambassador Maliha Lodhi said a political and humanitarian crisis is raging in the occupied valley. She said India's grave violations in occupied Kashmir are a threat to regional peace and security. Lodhi said time has come to speak up for law, justice and human rights of the Kashmiri people. The UN Secretary-General Guterres has expressed concerns over the deteriorating situation in the valley. Now, Indian-occupied Kashmir remains under lockdown after over a month. A total communications blackout is still in place as the Indian Army patrolled deserted roads, making sure that the lockdown is enforced. The United Nations has also shown deep concerns over the situation.
People are facing serious problems in Indian-occupied Kashmir. They are not even allowed to observe their religious rites any longer. Meanwhile, India has tightened its 6-week-long security clampdown even further. It has banned Ashura processions, which has infuriated locals.
No one is able to speak or raise their voice. They know that the event of Karbala and Ashura is a platform from where Kashmiris can raise their voice. This is an interference into our religious matters. We are against their clampdown.
Kashmiris consider India's latest step a violation of religious freedom.
We are only commemorating Muharram. We are not fighting against anyone. Injustice is happening with Muslims in Kashmir. Forces are brutal with us. We aren't throwing stones, but they are targeting us. They also targeted our religious centers, ransacking them and breaking glass doors and windows.
Meanwhile, Indian forces continue to detain people. The UN has taken notice of the situation, condemning the restrictions imposed by India.
United States President Donald Trump says he is ramping up the Afghan war after cancelling talks with the Taliban. Talks have been called off after an attack in Kabul, which killed an American soldier. President Trump said the US military onslaught on the Taliban is back up at its fiercest in a decade. However, Trump said he is still thinking about a drawdown of the 14,000 US soldiers in Afghanistan. Trump has reiterated that peace talks cannot continue after the insurgents claimed responsibility for last week's attack.
When I heard, very simply, that they killed one of our soldiers and 12 other innocent people, I said, there's no way I'm meeting on that basis. There's no way I'm meeting. They did a mistake. And by the way, they are telling people they made a big mistake.
Now, the Taliban have vowed to continue fighting against US forces in Afghanistan. Taliban spokesman Zabihullah Mujahid says the US will regret walking out of negotiations. Now, meanwhile, Afghan President Ashraf Ghani has called for peace talks and insisted on a ceasefire with the Taliban. Speaking to the military officers in Kabul, Ghani said negotiations without a ceasefire are impossible. Ghani's comments came after the US president called off peace talks with the Taliban over the killing of an American soldier. President Ghani said there are no limits for negotiations, but peace is not unconditional. He said Afghan forces are capable of breaking the Taliban's back. North Korea has launched 2 unidentified projectiles hours after it offered to resume nuclear talks with the US. South Korea's military says the missiles were launched from South Pyongan province towards the East Sea. Seoul says its military is monitoring the situation and is ready to stop any acts that could escalate tensions. Today's tests are the 8th such launch since July. Earlier, U.S. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo said Pyongyang has not violated any commitments to Washington regarding weapon testing. Meanwhile, North Korea's Vice Foreign Minister Cho Son-hui said a meeting could be held with the U.S. officials to resume talks. British parliamentarians have rejected a second attempt by Prime Minister Boris Johnson to call snap elections. The government fell short by 141 votes required to pass the motion. The British Parliament has ordered the government to seek an extension for leaving the European Union if there is no deal by October. Queen Elizabeth has approved legislation against no-deal Brexit after Prime Minister Johnson's failed attempts to pass the bill. Now, PM Johnson, addressing the Parliament after the results, said he would not delay Brexit any further.
No matter how many devices this Parliament invents to tie my hands, I will strive, Mr. Speaker, to get an agreement in the national interest.
Italy's Prime Minister Giuseppe Conte has won a confidence vote in the lower house of Parliament, confirming his new government's majority. The Parliament supported Conte's government by a majority of 343 out of 630 votes. Before it can be formally instated, Conte and his cabinet must win a similar vote in the Senate today. The PM said he hopes his new cabinet can help build a better Italy and improve ties with the EU. Conte formed a coalition government with the Five Star Movement and the pro-Europe Democratic Party. Hong Kong's leader Carrie Lam has warned the United States against interfering in the territory's internal matters. Lam said she deeply regrets interference by foreign parliaments in the Asian financial hub's matters after fresh protests. The chief executive pledged dialogue and asked for further violence to stop just after another weekend of violent clashes. Protesters marched to the U.S. consulate to call on Congress to pass a bill expressing support for the pro-democracy movement. Lam added that a proposed bill by the U.S. Congress that could strip the city of its trade privileges is unnecessary interference.
To interfere into Hong Kong's internal affairs in terms of what we are doing under the basic law, protection of freedoms and liberties, this is totally unnecessary. Because we ourselves have the obligation and the duty to comply with provisions in the basic law.
Well, Chinese officials have accused foreign forces of trying to hurt Beijing by creating chaos in Hong Kong. Moving on, let's go to Iraq. 15 ISIS militants have been killed in airstrikes during a military operation backed by the US-led coalition. The Iraqi military said 9 other militants have also been captured during ground operations in north-central Saladin province. Officials said security personnel were supported with airstrikes as clashes broke out after the operations. In 2017, authorities claimed that ISIS was beaten and Iraq gained territories once held by the terrorist group. Egypt says it supports efforts to remove Sudan from the US blacklist of state sponsors of terrorism. Foreign Minister Sameh Shoukry says Cairo has raised the issue with the United States. Shoukry says Egypt will continue pushing for an end to the sanctions in coordination with Sudanese authorities. He is in Khartoum to revive relations between the two neighbors. He met Sudan's PM Abdullah Hamdok, Foreign Minister Asma Abdullah, and Sovereign Council head General Abdel Fattah al-Burhan. Now, Saudi Arabia says it wants to enrich uranium in the future for its planned nuclear power program. Speaking at a conference in Abu Dhabi, Energy Minister Abdulaziz bin Salman said Saudi Arabia is planning to build 2 nuclear reactors. Prince Abdulaziz says the kingdom wants to diversify its energy mix. Riyadh is expected to issue the tender for the multi-billion-dollar project next year. US, Russian, South Korean, Chinese and French firms are involved in preliminary talks with the country. Prince Abdulaziz said there will be no radical change in Saudi oil policy. He says the OPEC Plus alliance will stay for the long term and called upon members to comply with output targets. The minister said oil production cuts will benefit all exporting nations. The US Coast Guard have rescued 4 remaining crew members aboard a South Korean vessel which capsized off the coast of Georgia. 20 members were rescued yesterday. The cargo ship Golden Ray was disabled in the St. Simons Sound after it suffered a fire on board. Crew members drilled an opening in the ship's massive hull, first to deliver food and water and then to extract them. The entire rescue operation took 35 hours. A group of 50 US states and territories have launched an antitrust investigation into Google's dominance of the online advertising market. Texas Attorney General Ken Paxton said the tech giant is threatening market competition and consumers. Paxton said the participating states have asked Google to provide documents on its advertising business. Washington, D.C.'s Attorney General Karl Racine said the investigation is preliminary and will lead to other issues, including data privacy.
50 attorney generals from different states and territories are launching an investigation into Google's potential monopolistic behavior.
A United States judge has reinstated a nationwide bar on a rule aimed at blocking asylum applications at the Mexican border. Earlier, a court of appeals narrowed the countrywide bar to the border states of California and Arizona. The Trump administration's rule required migrants who want asylum in the U.S. to first seek safe haven in a third country. The rule was part of President Donald Trump's anti-immigration policy, and President Trump has significantly slashed the number of refugees allowed into the U.S. since assuming office in 2017. The administration has capped the number of refugees at 30,000, down from 45,000 last year. Now, South Africa's President Cyril Ramaphosa has condemned xenophobic attacks in Johannesburg, which claimed 2 lives. The death toll in riots increased to 10 after the latest killings. 1 person was stabbed and another shot dead by a large group of armed attackers. Riot police fired stun grenades and rubber bullets to disperse crowds targeting shops. Many shops were set ablaze in the Malvern district. The attack started last week after lorry drivers staged a strike to protest against the employment of foreigners. Now, Muslims around the globe are marking Ashura. The day commemorates the martyrdom of Prophet Muhammad's grandson Imam Hussein in the Battle of Karbala in Iraq. Hundreds of thousands of pilgrims from the world head to Karbala at Imam Hussein's shrine to mark Ashura. The procession routes are dotted with drinking stalls to provide cold drinks and milk to participants and the general public. Globally, Muslims mourn to remember the blockade of water to Imam Hussein's camp after a siege by enemy forces. Hundreds of Australians have fled their homes as 140 bushfires ravaged parts of Queensland and New South Wales. Queensland Police Commissioner Katrina Carroll said at least 8 of the fires are suspicious and will be investigated. Queensland's acting Premier Jackie Trad said more than 400 people are present in the evacuation centres. She said no deaths have been reported yet.
We've got more than 400 people currently in evacuation centres, and unfortunately we will not be able to provide advice to them to return back to their homes until proper safety assessments have been done.
Now, the World Health Organization says suicide kills 1 person every 40 seconds across the world. A report has termed suicide a global public health issue.
More people die by suicide every year than in war or by homicide. A report by the World Health Organization says nearly 800,000 people die by suicide worldwide every year. It has specified hanging, poisoning, and shooting as the most common suicide methods.
So we see that there are an estimated 800,000 deaths from suicide in the world every year. And this translates to about 1 death every 40 seconds globally. Suicide is the 2nd leading cause of death among the age group of 18 to 29-year-olds.
The report found that nearly 3 times as many men as women die by suicide in wealthy countries, while the rates are equal in low and middle-income countries. WHO has called for action to reduce access to suicide means, including pesticides and firearms.
When we think about access to means, we know that in the region of Americas, access to firearms and guns is an important means of suicide. And basically, we would need to look, similarly to the pesticides, whether we can arrive at the reduction of the access to such means of suicide.
Global suicide rates have fallen in recent years, but the decline is inconsistent. WHO has urged governments to adopt suicide prevention plans to help people cope with stress.
Well, Jean Socrates has become the oldest person ever to sail around the world solo. She left Victoria back in October 2018. Let's take a look.
A 77-year-old British woman sailed into the history books and made a name for herself. She navigated the 36-foot boat into Victoria's Ogden Point in British Columbia, Canada. On her non-stop voyage, she was unassisted and spent more than 330 days alone at sea. Socrates has made several tries since 2016 to become the oldest person to navigate the globe alone. She had to abandon each try because of rough seas, boat damage, and sometimes a personal injury.
This as one of the greatest voyages of all times. A 77-year-old woman who's battled unbelievable hardships on this trip.
Hundreds of well-wishers waited for Socrates at the breakwaters of Victoria. Her close friend and fellow sailing buff Steve Illman welcomed her back at the Ogden Point. Illman said the radar dish, mainsail and the backup sail on Socrates' boat sustained damage during her voyage.
She's looking forward to having a very long hot bath and then eating a lovely meal and a nice glass of wine. Luckily, the Fairmont Empress Hotel has graciously donated that wish to her.
The septuagenarian sailor did not immediately talk to the media, but waved and smiled at her well-wishers.
While distinct in their practices, most cultures do enjoy puppetry. In Indonesia, bamboo puppetry is an art that is slowly dying. But one man's aim is to salvage the craft, modernize it, and feed the masses with local tradition. Take a look.
Nights in West Java are filled with excitement. Handheld puppets donning colorful headdresses and sarongs stage a fight to the rhythm of traditional music. Rajat Skandar has been lending a hand to reviving the near-extinct art of weighing bamboo, or bamboo puppetry.
I tried to portray local stories and folklore from our community with bamboo puppets. The end result was really amazing. On top of that, the stories of bamboo puppet we perform are also inspired by current affairs like brawls between students, drug problems, sexual freedom and politics, which are all issues that are widely discussed at the moment.
Skandar learned the art from his father, also a puppeteer. Now he has a full puppet troupe with an orchestra of 12 musicians. He also trains pupils.
In the past, I used to feel embarrassed, but after I learned more and participated in Sundanese arts and cultural performances, I became more enthusiastic about it.
Bookings for Skandar's shows have steadily increased over the years, which are popular among local audiences.
Now, it's been more than 30 years since Margaret Atwood wrote The Handmaid's Tale. The much-anticipated sequel has been released today. Fans flocked to Waterstone's flagship bookstore in central London for a midnight reading by Atwood herself. More in this report.
Londoners were transported to Margaret Atwood's fictional estate of Gilead. It was to celebrate the launch of the Testaments. It is the sequel to The Handmaid's Tale, a terrifying, misogynistic dystopia set in the US in the near future. Turned into a major television series, the book has become a feminist rallying point for the Me Too generation.
I mean, how many years now is it? I don't know, 40 years, 30 years on. And actually, the world in some ways is becoming a worse place for women, and particularly in the United States. And so this is very current and very relevant and very necessary.
Handmaids donning iconic red cloaks and white headpieces march through central London. The hats and cloaks have become a symbol of feminist struggles, but they resonate with other themes too.
I didn't think of it as feminist fiction. I just thought of it as one of the best pieces of science fiction that I've read, although at the time it seemed like it was describing a future that was obviously impossible because we were all much too sensible ever to get to that place.
The show has boosted sales of the novel, which has shifted 8 million copies worldwide in English alone. It has already been nominated for the 2019 Booker Prize, one of the English-speaking world's most prestigious literary awards.
First up in the world of business, the European Union has vowed to boost Cuba's economy. The EU Foreign Policy Chief Federica Mogherini said the bloc will also counter a wave of lawsuits against European firms. Meeting Cuban President Miguel Diaz-Canel, EU top diplomat Mogherini said the bloc rejects the US activation of the Helms-Burton Law. The 1996 law allows Cuban Americans to recover damages from the companies that do business with the Cuban state. The provision had been waived by every former US president to avoid conflicts with the European companies active in Cuba. The EU official said the bloc's investment will also help European companies consolidate their foothold on the island. US President Trump has tightened sanctions against Havana over rights violations and support for Venezuela's leftist regime. Jack Ma, who is the chairman of China's e-commerce giant Alibaba, has stepped down. In an already announced transition, the company's current CEO, Daniel Zhang, will replace him as executive chairman. Jack Ma co-founded Alibaba in 1999, making it one of the biggest online firms globally. Ma will stay on the company's board until his current term expires in 2020. Alibaba is now valued at $480 billion, making Jack Ma one of the richest men in China. He was also the first founder among a generation of prominent Chinese internet entrepreneurs to step down from the company. Well, let's take a look at the weather around the world. Well, that was all I have from the News Bulletin at the moment. Do stay tuned to Indus News for further updates. And as always, thanks for watching.